It's evening in a small American town. The streets are half empty, the air is filled with silence, when a black man in a business suit gets out of his car. He has just finished a long day of work after all. He is a judge, known for his honesty and impartiality. However, after a few minutes of calm, he is interrupted by the screeching brakes of a police car. A white cop gets out of the patrol car and heads straight towards him. "You are suspected of robbery," the officer blurts out. Without even having time to listen to the man, the judge tries to explain who he is, shows his ID, but his words are ignored. His hands are twisted behind his back, and now he is lying face down on the asphalt, feeling the cold metal of the handcuffs on his wrists. "You're just another criminal," the cop says, but what happens next shocks everyone. What do you think is the reason for this attitude? Write in the comments where you are watching this video from and what do you think about this situation. Is this just a misunderstanding or is there something more to it? Or maybe you have encountered something similar in your life? Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the continuation of this story. Judge James Williams was returning home after a long session. It was almost midnight, and the city streets were deserted. It was a small town in the southern United States, and although Williams was born there, he had always had to face invisible barriers. Despite his status and education, he knew that for many, he was a black man first and a judge second. As he turned onto the street leading to his home, the blue lights of a police car flashed behind him. "What the hell?" Williams thought as he parked his car at the curb. He was sure he hadn't broken any rules. A policeman approached the car, a young, white man with a stern expression. His posture and tone were alarming. "Documents, registration," the officer said coldly, looking at Williams with suspicion. "Of course, officer, but may I ask what I have violated?" James answered reservedly, taking documents out of his pocket. "We received a report of an armed robbery in this area." The policeman looked at the judge carefully, as if trying to catch the slightest sign of nervousness. "And you fit the description." Williams froze. He knew that neither his status nor his knowledge of the law would help him in this situation. He was a black man at night, and his words might not be taken seriously. "Officer, I am the judge of this city. I am returning home from work. I have nothing to do with the robbery," he explained calmly, trying not to let aggression into his voice. "We'll check that later." The policeman narrowed his eyes. "Get out of the car and stand facing the hood." James felt the tension in his body build. All he could do was comply. He slowly opened the door and walked out, knowing that any sudden gesture could be interpreted as a threat. The police officer quickly searched his car, then, finding nothing, returned to Williams. "Raise your hands," came the command. "Officer, this is a mistake. Put your hands up." This time the policeman's voice became harsher. Williams raised his hands, feeling a wave of anger and helplessness rise up inside him. He was being searched on the street like a criminal. Despite his status, despite all his accomplishments, he found himself in a position where the color of his skin mattered more than anything else. After searching him for several minutes without finding anything suspicious, the police officer still handcuffed him. "I'm sure we'll figure this out," Williams said through clenched teeth, not wanting to lose his dignity, but inside he was torn apart. "We'll figure out whether he's a judge or not," the officer chuckled, "but first you'll go with me to the station." As he was led to a patrol car, Williams suddenly realized that this was not just a random incident. This was a systematic manifestation of something he had been struggling with his entire life. As James Williams was placed in a patrol car, he felt the oppressive weight of memories from his childhood. He remembered how his father, a respected professor at a local college, had once been stopped by the police for parking illegally that had never happened. How his mother, a nurse for 30 years, had once been accused of shoplifting because the cashier thought it was strange that she was buying expensive items. It seemed that, no matter what they did, black people were always under suspicion. On the way to the station, James tried to maintain his composure. He knew that the action would have to be taken not here, not in the patrol car, but in court, on an official level. But anger was seething inside. How long would this go on? Even if he walked out of here as a man of his stature, how many more black men and women would be put in the same situations without hope of justice? When they arrived at the station, the officer who had arrested him was talking to his colleagues with a smug expression, as if he had caught the real deal. The other officers were looking at him with a mixture of disbelief and veiled contempt. In their eyes, Williams was not a judge. but simply a black man in handcuffs. "Are you sure it's the same guy?" one of the officers asked, keeping his eyes on Williams. "Yes, he fits the description, and whether he is a judge or not, we will figure it out later," answered the policeman who detained him. As James was led into the interrogation room, he felt eyes on him, scrutinizing, prejudiced. His handcuffs were removed, but he remained humiliated. One thought swirled through his mind: if even I, a judge, am not immune to such injustice, what is happening to ordinary people? An hour later, a detective entered the room, an elderly, rough-looking man with dull eyes. He sat down opposite Williams, looked him up and down, and exhaled. "Okay, tell me, how did you end up at the crime scene?" Williams barely contained his sarcasm. "I already told your officer that I was returning home from work. I have nothing to do with the robbery. This is absurd." "Absurd?" the detective asked, leaning closer. "We have a witness who claims to have seen a black man dressed like you leaving the store where the robbery took place. Tell me, how do you explain that?" James felt his anger rising again. That phrase, "black man," carried such weight, as if it automatically made him guilty. He knew that if it had been a white man, the conversation would have gone differently. "You're not even trying to find out the truth," Williams said quietly. "All your questions are based on one thing: I'm black, therefore I'm a suspect." The detective pursed his lips in displeasure and stepped back. "We're doing our job. No need to play the victim." The words cut like a knife through skin. Victim is a word that has been too often applied to black people when they try to speak out about injustice. It has been a weapon to silence them, to diminish their experiences. At that moment, the door to the room swung open. Another officer entered, this time a senior officer. It was Captain Richardson, a white man with gray hair and a stern expression. He paused, assessing the situation, and then turned his gaze to the detective. "Are you serious?" he asked coldly, ignoring the detective's surprise. "You arrested Judge Williams?" The officers in the room froze. Williams knew Richardson. He was one of the few white officers who respected him as a judge and as a person. "The judge?" The detective frowned and looked at Williams as if he was seeing him for the first time. But he is a respected man, and if you had done any of your work you would know it." Richardson interrupted sharply. "Drop all charges immediately." The detective remained silent, embarrassed, but Williams saw his face contort with irritation. This wasn't just a random mistake. It was a systematic approach to black people that permeated society at every level. When his handcuffs were removed, Williams stood up, but he didn't feel relief. Instead, he felt a deep-seated sense of injustice from all those years of fighting for equality. Richardson walked up to him and said quietly, "Forgive me for this, Judge. I will personally deal with those who made this mistake." "This isn't just a mistake, Captain," Williams said, looking him in the eye. "This is a problem that goes deeper than your precinct or my handcuffs, and it won't go away until we start changing the system, not the individuals." The captain nodded, but his eyes showed that he didn't fully understand the depth of the judge's words. The system they lived in was built on bias and racism, and fighting that was much more difficult than simply correcting one mistake. There was a tense silence in the room after James's handcuffs were removed. The officers looked at each other as if waiting for what would happen next. The judge stood there, rubbing his wrists, still feeling the cold metal on his skin. He was calm on the outside, but inside he was filled with rage and helplessness. "Judge, I apologize again for this incident," Captain Richardson began, trying to smooth things over. "You see, our officer was simply following procedure. We received a call, and—" "Procedure?" Williams interrupted sharply, his voice betraying the first hint of anger in the conversation. "You call that a procedure? Stopping me just because I'm black, based on a vague description? You don't see anything problematic about that?" Captain Richardson frowned, clearly not expecting this reaction. He was sure that an apology and a quick exit from the situation would settle the conflict. "Judge, I understand your indignation, but the officer was just doing his job. We can't ignore a call, especially when it comes to armed robbery. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time." "The wrong time and place?" James gritted his teeth, feeling his anger grow into barely contained rage. "I've heard that expression my whole life. When I was a teenager, it was the wrong time and place. When my friends were pulled over for no reason, it was the wrong time and place. And every time it was about one thing: their skin color." The captain opened his mouth to answer, but the judge did not give him a chance to get a word in. "Are you saying that if it were a white man in a suit in my place, you would stop him, search him, handcuff him without a shred of evidence, just because some witness saw a black man?" Captain Richardson glanced quickly at the officer who had arrested Williams, but the officer, sensing the growing tension, avoided eye contact. "Listen," the captain finally said, collecting his thoughts, "nobody is saying this has to do with your skin color. It's just a coincidence. A call came in, and our officer had to respond. We're all professionals here, and we work within the letter of the law." "By the letter of the law?" James laughed, but it was a bitter laugh, full of sarcasm. "That law was not written for the likes of me. Your procedures are built on bias. Your duties are to protect one part of society and suspect another. That is not justice, Captain. That is racism, which you try to justify with bureaucratic words." "That's too serious a charge, Judge." Richardson's voice hardened. He felt like he was losing control of the situation. "I respect you, but I can't have you talking about my unit like that. No one here is prejudiced." Williams stepped forward, approaching the captain. "You speak of bias? I am a man of the law, Captain. I have spent thousands of hours in the courtroom, dealing with cases where black defendants face injustice on a regular basis, simply because of the color of their skin. I see people like your officer every day using procedure to justify their behavior. You may deny it, but it is true, and you know it." Richardson tensed, feeling his own irritation growing. "I am not going to discuss this matter with you here and now. We have sorted out the misunderstanding. I apologize to you, and if you wish to file a complaint against my officer's actions, you have every right to do so." "A complaint?" Williams chuckled. "You think I'm going to file a complaint and it's going to change anything? How many people like me file complaints that end up in the archives without any consequences? How many lives have been ruined because you turn a blind eye to your own mistakes?" The policeman who arrested the judge finally couldn't take it anymore and intervened. "Look, I was just doing my job. Don't make this a racial issue. I didn't know you were a judge. I was following instructions. I would have detained anyone who fit the description." Williams turned to face him, his eyes blazing. "Anyone? You mean if I were white you would have stopped me the same way, without a shred of evidence, with just the description of a black male?" James raised his voice, and his tone was bitter with years of struggle. The officer was clearly nervous. His face was red and he was trying to hide his irritation. Yes, I would stop. It doesn't matter who you are. I would detain anyone." "You think so?" James stepped closer. "Do you really believe you were acting without bias? You just randomly decided that a black man in a suit on the street at night was a criminal?" The silence in the room became unbearable. The policeman stood there, unsure of what to say. All his arguments crumbled before a truth he could neither ignore nor accept. This was not just an arrest. It was a symbol of how deeply ingrained the system is that divides people by the color of their skin, forcing black men and women to prove their innocence every time they are suspected. Captain Richardson realized that the situation could no longer be smoothed over. Too much had been said, and too much depended on their actions at this moment. After this tense exchange in the interrogation room, Captain Richardson directed the officers to release Williams. However, his face showed a mixture of confusion and displeasure. Inside, he knew that this situation had not only damaged his unit's reputation, but it also exacerbated a problem that could not be solved by an apology. James left the station, but his thoughts remained troubled. Although he had technically been released, he felt he had been victimized by yet another system that created complex and invisible barriers for black people. Now he was about to confront that on a deeper level. When James returned home, his wife, Layla, greeted him with concern. "How did it go?" she asked, seeing the tiredness and irritation on his face. "As always," Williams replied, taking off his coat. "I'm free, but that doesn't change anything. I'm back in the middle of one of those situations we talk about all the time, but nothing changes." "So what now?" Layla asked, supporting him. "Now I have to fight it." James looked at her, "But I'm not sure I have enough power to change anything." The next day, Williams decided to file a formal complaint against the officers. He knew it wouldn't solve all the problems, but he felt compelled to take the step. However, when he went to the office to file his complaint, he encountered another problem. The office he was sent to was full of forms and procedures, and every action seemed designed to make the process of filing a complaint as difficult as possible. The staff's attention was superficial. and they clearly had no interest in listening to his complaint. "We'll review your case," the clerk said, her eyes still on her computer screen, "but know that it may take some time. We get a lot of complaints." "A lot of complaints?" James looked at her in surprise. "I was just arrested without cause, and you're telling me that's just part of the procedure?" "We stick to protocol," the clerk snapped. "The process takes time and paperwork. Everything will be reviewed." Williams felt his anger rising. Filing a complaint had become yet another obstacle placed in front of him to make his fight even more difficult. He left the office feeling his frustration growing. Meanwhile, his case began to attract the attention of the local media, and public opinion was divided. Some supported him, while others began to accuse him of trying to use his position to his advantage. An article in a local newspaper, headline "Judge or Criminal?" with a photo of James in handcuffs, became the subject of discussion. The article claimed that Williams was too sensitive to the case and that his reaction was over the top. This fueled a wave of criticism against the judge and brought him even more attention. There was also a local blogger among the newspaper's readers who quickly noticed the problem of racism and took it up. He published an article about how often black men are victims of bias, and how this incident only highlights the existing problem. The blogger accused local leadership and the police of ignoring systemic problems and injustice. Soon, a campaign in support of Williams began, with protests and demonstrations outside police headquarters. People of all races and nationalities gathered to express their anger and solidarity. James was overwhelmed by the scale of the public response, but it also made him feel even more vulnerable. Things got worse when anonymous threats came to his work at the court. Some of his colleagues began to distance themselves, fearing possible repercussions. This pressure, caused not only by the case itself but also by public opinion, began to affect his work and life. Williams woke up every morning feeling oppressed. He felt like his fight for justice was becoming a personal ordeal, where he was not just fighting the system, but also his own sense of being the target of societal stigma and racial bias. The problem he faced wasn't just his arrest, it was the systemic discrimination and inequality he was now feeling on his own skin. And despite his best efforts to change the situation, he knew it would be a long and difficult road. Racism was deeply ingrained in society, and addressing it would take more than a complaint or a lawsuit. Every day became more difficult. Relationships with colleagues, social pressure, and a constant sense of injustice began to destroy his inner world. James knew that his struggle was just beginning and that he had to remain steadfast in his mission despite personal and professional difficulties. And now, as his strength began to wane, he had to decide how to move forward, fight to the end, or look for another way to fight for justice. The situation continued to escalate. The city began to split into two camps, those who supported Williams and those who opposed him. The public pressure he was experiencing reached such a level that his safety became a topic of discussion. Rumors of possible threats against him began to circulate, and every day was filled with anxiety. One evening, when James returned home after a long day, his wife noticed that he looked especially tired. "You shouldn't have gone out today," Layla said, her voice full of worry. "You know there are a lot of people around who don't approve of what you're doing." "I can't sit at home and hide," Williams said, taking off his shoes. "I have to keep working and fighting for justice." "But you're right," he sighed heavily. "Every time I go out, I feel like a target." Layla kissed him on the cheek, but her eyes were full of worry. The next day, her fears were confirmed. On his way to work, James noticed that he was being followed. An unknown car followed him the entire way, and every time he stopped, it stopped too. As he approached the court, the car finally disappeared, but his fear did not subside. As he entered the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. Coworkers and staff avoided eye contact with him, and some even whispered as he passed. The desk in his office was littered with hate mail and threats. One envelope contained an ominous note: "You'll be next." James tried to focus on his work, but the pressure became unbearable. His colleagues became even more guarded and cold. At one meeting on the case, where his presence was mandatory, his fellow white judge refused to discuss important issues while Williams was in the room. "We need to resolve this without your participation," the judge said, avoiding Williams's gaze. "You can come back later." This feeling of isolation and hostility became a daily reality for James. Every step he took was accompanied by the feeling of being watched and judged. Some of his colleagues supported him verbally, but when it came to action, most were silent. One day, After a particularly difficult day in which he had faced open resistance from the local community, James decided to take a walk to clear his head. It was not an easy decision. He knew that in this city his movements could be tracked. In the park where he usually liked to relax, he noticed a group of men who began to follow him. Their looks were wary and threatening. Soon one of them came closer and began to shout, "Haven't you learned yet that this is no place for people like you? You can leave now until we deal with you." Williams felt the fear rising. These weren't just words. He knew the situation could escalate at any second. He tried to remain calm, but the tension inside him was unbearable. "I'm just taking a walk," he said with restraint, trying not to show how scared he really was. "Please leave me alone." One of the men stepped closer, and James noticed that he had something shiny in his hand, possibly a weapon. At that moment, he felt his heart beat faster. He quickly walked towards the park exit, trying not to speed up so as not to provoke them. When he returned home, he felt exhausted and depressed. Layla saw his condition and made a decision. "We must take steps to ensure your safety," she said firmly. "You must be safe. I cannot remain calm knowing that you are in danger." She insisted that they hire a private security company. Security became a constant feature of their lives. Every time James left the house, he felt their presence. This situation only deepened his feelings of alienation and helplessness. Meanwhile, in court and in society, the campaign against him continued to mount. Media and public figures began to use his name as a symbol for various agendas, some supporting him, others using him to advance their own interests. James became increasingly aware that his personal tragedy had become part of a larger, more complex political game. When he tried to appeal to his colleagues for support, many of them, although initially expressing their solidarity, now avoided speaking out in his defense. The level of fear and prejudice was too great. Even those who were willing to help felt indifferent in the face of pressure and threats. James Williams eventually became a symbol of the struggle, but his own life became a nightmare in which racism, prejudice, and fear became his constant companions. Every morning when he woke up, he asked himself, would this day be a new challenge in his fight for justice or another stage in his personal tragedy? With each passing day, his feelings of oppression grew, and he knew that if he didn't fight it at the systemic level, that fight would result in even greater personal sacrifice. Williams found himself in a vortex where his personal safety and professional purpose faced immeasurable challenges, all under the dark cloud of racism that still permeated every aspect of his life. As the days dragged on, James Williams found that the fight for justice had become a constant, grueling struggle for survival. His life was at stake, and the feeling of oppressive pressure never left him for a moment. One evening, after a particularly tough day in court, James returned home and noticed that Layla didn't look like her usual self. She was sitting in the kitchen, her face gray with stress and fatigue. "What happened?" Williams asked, looking at her worriedly. "I got a call," Layla said, her voice shaking. "Someone said they knew where we lived and that they might come after us if you didn't stop what you were doing." James felt fear and rage wash over him. He knew it could only be a threat, but the knowledge that his family could be targeted too was unbearable. "We have to do something," Layla continued. "We can't just sit and wait for something to happen." They turned to law enforcement for help, but the response was discouraging. The policeman who came to them was clearly not interested in their safety. He listened to their story, but his eyes betrayed his displeasure. "We understand your concerns," he said, "but we have a lot to do. We can patrol your area, but we cannot guarantee your safety 24/7. If something is troubling you, please let us know right away." This response only deepened the feelings of helplessness and betrayal. James felt that the system he was trying to reform was simply ignoring him and his family. The next day, James decided to make a public statement. He wanted to use media platforms to draw attention to his situation and increase pressure on law enforcement. His decision attracted attention from both those who supported him and those who were against him. At a press conference, James spoke to the cameras, fighting back tears, as he described his experiences, how he and his family have been threatened, and how he has been a victim of systemic racism. "I'm not just a judge," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I'm a person who wants justice, but now my family and I are facing threats because I'm trying to fight for that justice. This isn't just my problem. This is the problem of everyone who faces systemic discrimination." His words resonated with the public. Some began organizing protests in support of Williams, demanding better protection for his family and reforms to the police and judicial systems. However, There were also those among the demonstrators who exploited the situation for their own gain or sought to fuel hostility and violence. That evening, as James and Layla were getting ready for bed, they heard a strange noise outside. Layla looked out the window and saw a crowd of protesters gathered outside their house, some of whom were acting aggressively. James went outside to calm the people down, but this only caused more chaos. "We can't let this go on," he said, trying to calm the crowd. "Please come home. My family and I need your understanding, not violence." The crowd did not react as he had hoped. Some of the participants began to shout and demonstrate violent actions. Ultimatums and threats were in the air, and even those who had initially supported him began to disperse. When James returned home, his heart was pounding in his chest, and he felt his fight and quest for justice becoming increasingly difficult. The psychological pressure had become unbearable. He felt isolated and abandoned, despite public support. His personal safety and the safety of his family were at risk, and even systemic reforms seemed out of reach. In this constant stress and fear, he began to doubt his own strength and whether he could continue to fight. Every day he had to face aggression, threats and prejudice, which only reinforced his sense of being a victim. His life, work and future were at stake, and he had to decide how to find the strength to continue the fight despite all the difficulties and pressure. And each day became more difficult, reminding James that the path to justice was not only difficult, but often associated with personal sacrifice and risk. After the intense protests outside their home, James and Layla felt their lives were a constant state of threat and stress. James became increasingly consumed with thoughts of systemic injustice that seemed to have no end. He knew his own struggle was just a drop in the ocean of a much larger problem. The next day, James decided to go public with an even more personal statement. He wrote an article for a local newspaper about his experiences and how racism and bias had permeated every aspect of his life. The article was full of personal stories and emotion, and James hoped it would help others understand the scope of the problem. James Williams' newspaper article: "I stand before you today not only as a judge, but also as a person who has faced the deep and painful reality of racism. Recent events in which I have been the target of bias and discrimination only highlight that this problem affects not only me, but millions of others. In my case, I face racism not only in my profession, but also in my everyday life. My arrest and subsequent pressure is not just an accident, it is an example of how the system and societal biases work not only against Black people, but against everyone who tries to fight this evil. Every day I feel how society refuses to see the reality of people who are subjected to racism. We must understand that racism is not limited to acts of violence or discrimination. It is a systemic problem that permeates every aspect of life, from law enforcement to the justice system and even in everyday interactions. If we do not begin to see and correct this problem, we will never achieve true equality. My request to each of you is to start paying attention to your own bias, acknowledge its existence and take steps to overcome it. This will not only help those who suffer from racism, but will also make our society more just and humane." The article caused a storm of emotions. The reaction was mixed. Many people supporting James expressed gratitude for his candor and courage, but there were also harsh comments accusing him of trying to profit from his situation and inciting hatred. His words did not leave civil society organizations indifferent either. In response to the article, several activist groups organized events to raise awareness about racism and create opportunities for dialogue. These events attracted media attention and helped raise issues that had previously been hidden under a veil of silence. But despite the growing public debate, James continued to face personal challenges. At work, his colleagues continued to distance themselves, and his case became the subject of criticism within the judicial system. Some judges and lawyers openly questioned his ability to make impartial decisions, viewing his allegations as biased and exaggerated. The situation reached a new level of tension when James received an anonymous threatening letter. The letter said that if he did not stop his efforts to fight racism, his life would be in danger. He took the letter to the police, but again the response was disappointing. The police said that they had no concrete leads and that they could not guarantee his safety. With no official support available, James and Layla decided to take extra precautions. They hired private security and began taking extra steps to ensure their safety. James also began talking to lawyers and human rights organizations to try to raise awareness of their situation and try to change public attitudes toward racism. Meanwhile, public opinion continued to be divided. Some considered James a hero for highlighting an important issue, while others accused him of creating conflict. All of this created additional pressure and exacerbated his inner turmoil. James felt that his fight against the system was becoming not only a personal tragedy, but also a public tragedy. Despite the support of activists and a part of society, James continued to face difficulties that initially arose from his public call for justice. His personal life, his family and his professional career became a battleground where racism and bias turned out to be the main enemies. And now, as the pressure mounted, James realized that his job was not just to fight for himself, but to push for change that could impact society as a whole. But as each day became more difficult, he felt that his personal sacrifices could be part of a broader, deeper fight for justice and equality. James Williams continued to feel like his life and work were becoming an arena for ongoing struggle. Every morning he woke up to new challenges. Every event and every public interaction deepened his inner conflict. Suddenly, despite his best efforts, things seemed to be getting even darker. One day, early in the morning, when James was just getting ready for work, his attention was drawn to the noise outside his house. Looking out the window, he saw several police cars parked in front of his house, and several journalists next to them. Fear embraced him, and he felt his heart beat faster. When he left the house, one of the policemen approached him and said, "We have received new orders. You need to follow us to the station." "What orders?" James asked, trying to hide his excitement. "I don't understand what's going on." "You have a new charge of forgery," the policeman said, holding up a summons. "This case is related to your work. We need to question you about it." James was shocked. He knew that the charge of forgery was a serious one and could ruin his entire career. He tried to explain that it couldn't be true, but the policeman, not listening to his explanation, insisted that he go with them. When he arrived at the station, the situation only worsened. There were journalists and cameras waiting for him. The forgery charge had attracted public attention, and now his case had become another sensation. During interrogation, he was surrounded by police officers who asked questions, ignoring his answers in attempts to explain his innocence. "This is absurd," James exclaimed. "I didn't fake anything. This is another attempt to discredit me." But his screams seemed to make matters worse. The police seemed to have already concluded that he was guilty and were biased against him. Even though James had nothing to do with the charges, his efforts to convince them of his innocence were in vain. As the investigation continued, James was faced with another difficult reality. His colleagues and the public began to question his integrity. Articles and reports began to appear in the media portraying him as a corrupt and incompetent judge. The forgery charge was used as evidence that he was not only biased, but also a fraud. Layla, worried about the situation, tried to find lawyers who could defend James, but her efforts were complicated by public opinion and pressure. Even those lawyers who were willing to help began to reject the case for fear of public condemnation and possible repercussions. Meanwhile, James was trapped. The press and public continued to press him, spreading rumors and speculation about his case. His colleagues in the court began to avoid him, and some even spoke out against him. James felt his professional and personal life crumbling before his eyes. On the day his case was to go to trial, James was exhausted and depressed. He sat in the courtroom, surrounded by his defense, but he felt alone and helpless. The forgery charges were being heard against a backdrop of massive pressure and bias. In court, the charges were based on false testimony and faulty documents that were planted to strengthen the case against him. James knew that his innocence could be proven, but the trial was drawn out and his reputation was already in ruins. The whole situation seemed part of a larger campaign against him, orchestrated to finally discredit him as a person and as a professional. Over the next month, James endured numerous court hearings, each of which only deepened his sense of victimhood. Although he had managed to defend his reputation and ultimately prove his innocence, he had already lost much. His job was at risk, his personal life was damaged, and his family suffered from constant stress and danger. Winning in court could not bring back the years and connections that James had lost. He knew that the fight for justice he had waged had left deep scars on his life and the lives of those around him. He faced the consequences of his fight every day, and while he was relieved that his innocence had been established, he knew that his road to healing and recovery would be long and difficult. The racism and bias he encountered were not just problems he was trying to solve, but elements of a deeply entrenched system that he now had to find a way to address. James continued his work, but his perception of the system and his place in society were forever changed. Every day was a reminder that the fight for justice does not end with one victory, but requires constant attention and effort. James Williams, despite his legal victory, felt his life continue to unravel. His return to normal life was more difficult than he expected. The isolation and constant pressure left deep marks on his emotional state and on his family. Layla, his support, became increasingly depressed. The time spent under threat and stress had worn her down. She decided to move in with relatives to cope with her own experiences. When she returned, their relationship was no longer the same. James felt that he had lost not only his career, but also an important part of his life. Without Layla's support, James sank into loneliness and depression. He would often wake up in the middle of the night with nightmares of the violence and threats he had faced. The psychological trauma became unbearable. Every morning became a struggle, and his work in court only added to the pressure. One day, as James was walking home, he was stopped by a group of aggressive people. They began to insult and threaten him, and then became physically violent. James tried to defend himself, but the crowd was too large and violent. He was beaten, his clothes were torn and his face was bruised. The attack left him in critical condition and required immediate hospitalization. After the attack, James ended up in the hospital with a severe concussion and multiple injuries. His condition was critical, and doctors were fighting to save his life. Layla, upon learning what had happened, returned home to be with her husband. She spent days and nights in the hospital, praying for his recovery and facing the added burden of medical expenses. While James was in a coma, public attention continued unabated. Controversy and protests continued to surround his case. His condition was used to create new accusations and discussions, which only increased his suffering and created additional difficulties for his family. His medical expenses mounted, and Layla faced financial difficulties trying to cover them while public pressure continued to mount. The systemic problems and biases James faced seemed hopeless and insurmountable, and every day his family struggled to find hope and strength in this difficult and tragic situation. As James Williams began to recover from the attack, racism and prejudice continued to plague his life. Despite his physical improvement, emotional and professional challenges continued to weigh on him. Having struggled to return to work, James found that his colleagues began to openly express dissatisfaction with his presence. Doubts about his objectivity and honesty became a topic of discussion in the judicial system. Some judges and lawyers publicly stated that his experiences and subsequent trauma had made him biased. These accusations further aggravated his situation and caused internal conflict. In the media, James continued to be the center of attention, but now in the context of new accusations and distortions. The media used his name and his cases to create scandals and reinforce racist stereotypes. Every article and report was filled with preconceived notions about his person and work. James became a symbol of racial conflict, a distorted image that did him even more harm. At a public event dedicated to human rights, James was the victim of another attack. People supporting opposing views staged a protest, turning the event into chaos. The insults and physical violence he suffered once again put him in the public spotlight as a victim of hatred and violence. These events left deep scars in his family. Layla, who continued to support James, also suffered emotional exhaustion. The constant pressure and threat to their family's safety was destroying her mental health, and even simple moments of joy became difficult. James's teenage children also suffered the consequences. They were the target of ridicule and prejudice at school and among their friends. The Williams family's life, under the weight of racism and social stigma, became a constant struggle to maintain normalcy and dignity. Every day was filled with challenges for James and his family, not just from personal experiences but from systemic issues that seemed to permeate every aspect of their lives. The racism and bias they faced left an indelible mark on their lives. James Williams' situation, despite his physical recovery, remained extremely difficult. Racism and prejudice continued to define every aspect of his life, and the previous robbery charge that had gotten him arrested kept coming up again and again, adding fuel to the fire. As a reminder, a few months ago James, a respected judge, was arrested by a white police officer who accused him of robbery. The accusation turned out to be false, but its consequences were disastrous. Although James was able to prove his innocence in court, his reputation was seriously damaged, and his professional and personal life were destroyed. Now, after the attack, James found himself in the middle of a scandal again. His opponents and critics used the old accusation as an additional weapon against him. They claimed that James was still involved in criminal activity, citing his previous troubles with the law. These accusations were backed by slander and bias, but that did not stop them from spreading. Public attention focused on the fact that James had allegedly used his position to escape punishment for a crime. This false version of events caused a wave of indignation and outrage. New media reports and articles once again highlighted his case, presenting him as a symbol of systemic injustice, but with a menacing focus on his alleged crime. James and Layla faced new challenges as they struggled to cope with the aftermath of the attack and the public pressure. Each new article and report continued to erode the remains of their reputations, forcing them to fight not only for their personal safety but also for justice. Layla, unable to withstand the pressure, increasingly withdrew into herself, and James felt that each new attack only deepened their suffering. James's inner conflict deepened. He felt trapped, where his every move and word could be used against him. Even after he had proven his innocence in court, public opinion remained biased. His peers and the public rejected him, and James was forced to watch his life continue to crumble under the weight of racism and slander. His children also faced difficulties. School friends and classmates began to mock them, citing accusations of robbery against their father. This led to the children withdrawing from communication and experiencing serious psychological problems, which further worsened the family's difficulties. James continued to seek justice and support, but felt his efforts were insufficient against the scale of systemic injustice. He began to actively participate in advocacy organizations and reach out to the public, hoping for change that would alleviate the suffering of not only his family, but everyone who experiences racism and bias. Every day was a struggle for James, not only for his own recovery, but also for recognition of the racism that permeated every aspect of his life and the lives of his family. And while James remained steadfast in his efforts, he knew that true recovery and justice would take time and struggle, and that his own experience was only one part of a much larger problem. As James Williams began to recover from the attack, racism and prejudice continued to weigh on his life. Even as he improved physically, he continued to face challenges that did not abate. Public opinion and the previous robbery charge that had led to his arrest were back in the forefront. The situation was such that despite James being cleared of false charges and proven innocent in court, public reports and opinions continued to paint a negative image of him. The media actively used his past robbery conviction to reinforce racist stereotypes and create an image of James as someone who was involved in criminal activity. These distortions of the facts continued to make his situation worse. Public protests against James became increasingly violent. At one such event, which James attended as a private citizen to support human rights, a crowd of protesters with opposing views became violent. They shouted insults, accused James of crimes he had not committed, and created chaos. His home began to receive threats again, and his family was put at risk. Layla, his wife, and children also began to face serious difficulties. Layla, emotionally and physically exhausted, once again returned to relatives to try to find peace and support, but her absence only increased the tension in the house. James, being alone, sank deeper into depression, and constant pressure from the public only worsened his suffering. James' children had a difficult time at school. Their classmates and teachers, having learned of their father's past, began to tease and isolate them. They faced ridicule and prejudice, which led to mental health problems and a decline in academic performance. James and Layla tried to support their children, but the emotional toll on the entire family was too great. James's professional difficulties also continued unabated. His colleagues on the bench began to openly criticize him, claiming that his personal experiences had made him biased and unable to judge cases objectively. Escalating tensions at work added to his feelings of isolation and stress. Some colleagues even expressed a desire for him to resign, which only added to the pressure on James. Financial difficulties also became a serious problem. James' family was forced to spend huge amounts of money on medical expenses and legal services. Even with the support of charities, aid was often delayed and insufficient to cover all needs. These financial difficulties only added to the stress and increased feelings of helplessness. Despite all the challenges, James continued to seek ways to combat racism and systemic injustice. He became active in advocacy groups, using his story to draw attention to issues of racism. James also began working to create a fund for victims of racist attacks, hoping to make a difference and provide support to others facing similar issues. Still, every day was a struggle for James. The memory of the attack, the constant pressure from the public, and the difficulties within his family created a sense of never-ending stress. His story was not only a personal tragedy, but also a symbol of the larger problem of racism and systemic injustice. James continued to strive for justice, but he knew the road to change would be long and difficult. Racism continued to deeply impact James Williams' life. permeating every aspect of his existence and destroying everything he had built. After all the hardships he had endured and the fight for justice, he saw how racism and bias were ingrained in the system and how they were destroying his personal and professional life. Professional difficulties. In court, James felt the pressure mounting. Although he continued to carry out his duties, his colleagues, some of whom had openly expressed doubts about his competence, now began to criticize his decisions and actions. These colleagues used the old robbery charge as a way to undermine his credibility and question his integrity and professionalism. Every morning, when James came to work, he was faced with hostility and mistrust. He noticed how some colleagues avoided communicating with him, how they began to whisper behind his back and exchange displeased glances. The court hearings in which he participated became an arena for open attacks and undermining of his reputation. Even those who had previously supported him began to distance themselves, fearing association with his case. Social isolation and public condemnation. The public condemnation continued unabated. With each new report, James became the target of ridicule and scorn. His name appeared more and more frequently in newspaper headlines and news reports, where he was portrayed as a symbol of racial conflict and criminal activity. This constant attention only increased his sense of isolation. James continued to face aggressive comments and threats on social media and in public discussions. These attacks were not only personal, but also targeted his family, making their lives even more difficult. Layla and the children were also the target of bias and ridicule, which only added to the stress and anxiety in their home. Financial and emotional difficulties. Financial difficulties continued to weigh on the family. Medical bills and legal expenses continued, and despite help from charities, their funds were often insufficient to cover all needs. James and Layla were constantly worried about the future, trying to find ways to cope with financial difficulties. The emotional burden James was carrying was enormous. The trauma of the attack and the stigma surrounding it began to take a toll on his mental health. He often suffered from anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Every morning, James faced a sense of hopelessness as he realized his fight was not over. Family problems and broken relationships. Family relationships were also under threat. Constant tension and fear for the family's safety led to serious disagreements. Layla, despite all her efforts to support James, was emotionally exhausted. Constant threats and pressure from society and financial difficulties created additional strain in their relationship. James' children struggled in school and social interactions. Their classmates and even teachers often showed prejudice, using their father's name as a reason for ridicule and discrimination. These problems negatively affected their academic performance and emotional well-being. Constant struggle for justice. Despite the challenges, James never stopped fighting. He continued to participate in advocacy events and speaking engagements, hoping to bring attention to issues of racism and systemic injustice. Creating a fund for victims of racist attacks was his way of changing the system and supporting others. However, James knew that his own problems would not be solved so easily. Every day, James was reminded of how deeply ingrained racism was in society. He felt like his personal struggle was just one part of a larger problem, and he knew that change would take much more effort and time. James continued to look for ways to improve his life and the lives of his family, but he knew that the road to justice and equality remained long and difficult. James Williams continued to deal with the daily consequences of racism that permeated every aspect of his life. In court, his situation became even more tense. Colleagues who had once respected him for his professionalism now openly questioned his competence. Some criticized his decisions, citing his race and bias as the root cause of their dissatisfaction. James came to work each day knowing that he would be dogged by indirect accusations and bias. The public situation was no better. The previous robbery charge, although disproven, continued to haunt him. The media wasted no opportunity to exploit his story for sensationalism. New reports once again cast him in a negative light, portraying James as a symbol of racial injustice and crime. Every headline and every mention in the press created new waves of public condemnation and reinforced prejudice. In the midst of these difficulties, James and his family continued to experience enormous stress. Layla, his wife, was emotionally exhausted. The constant threats and social pressure made her life unbearable. She spent a lot of time thinking about how to protect her family and ensure their safety. These worries only increased the tension in their relationship. Misunderstandings and conflicts accumulated between Layla and James, related to their new lifestyle and constant fear. James' children faced rejection and ridicule at school. Their classmates and even teachers often used their father's name as a pretext for humiliation and prejudice. These experiences negatively affected their academic performance and mental health. They began to avoid social interactions, experiencing stress and anxiety from their family being the subject of public attention. Financial difficulties added to the problem. Medical bills and legal expenses continued to mount, and despite help from charities, funds were still not enough. James and Layla spent hours each week trying to find ways to cope with the financial difficulties. These efforts often ended in failure, adding to their feelings of hopelessness. Uncertainty and fear for the future continued to haunt James. He tried to combat these feelings by getting involved in advocacy groups and supporting community events. Creating a fund for victims of racist attacks was a way for him to regain a sense of control and meaning in his life. He hoped that his experiences and efforts would help others facing similar challenges and contribute to broader changes in society. However, each new intervention in his life, each new attack and public condemnation only deepened his personal suffering. James felt that his fight was not over, and that the system in which he was trying to find justice still needed significant changes. He continued to look for ways to improve his situation and that of his family, but he knew that the road to justice remained long and difficult. Every day, James and his family continued to experience the effects of racism that permeated their lives and destroyed their dreams of normalcy. This struggle, although difficult, became for them a symbol of a larger issue that required attention and action at the societal level. James remained steadfast in his efforts despite the difficulties and continued to believe in the possibility of change, hoping that his experiences would help make the world a more just place for everyone. James Williams knew that fighting racism couldn't be limited to just personal efforts to restore one's reputation. His suffering and challenges became an impetus for more active work to change the situation and fight systemic injustice. He began his fight against racism through his involvement in community and advocacy organizations, where he shared his experiences and raised important questions about racism and bias. One of James's first steps was to create a fund for victims of racist attacks. The fund provided financial, legal, and psychological help to those who had experienced racism. James actively brought the project to the attention of the public and the media, hoping to raise funds and create a resource that could help many people in similar situations. He organized a number of events to raise awareness for the fund, and his efforts began to bear fruit, helping some victims of racist attacks. James also became a prominent figure in the media. He actively collaborated with journalists and producers to create documentaries and reports on systemic racism. These media projects showed not only his personal story, but also the larger context of racist bias in society. James used his public appearances and interviews to emphasize that his case was part of a larger problem that required attention and action. He demanded reforms in law enforcement and the judicial system, seeking transparency and accountability. Education and awareness were another important part of his fight. James organized lectures and workshops for students, teachers, and community activists to explain the roots of racism and how to combat it. These educational events were aimed at raising awareness and creating a more inclusive society. James also worked to create educational resources, such as books and articles, that explained in detail the effects of racism and bias, and how to combat these issues on a personal and social level. Despite his best efforts, James continued to face challenges. He still felt pressure from the public and from his professional life. However, his continued activism and commitment became an example of how to confront systemic injustice. His personal struggle became a symbol of a larger issue, and James continued to believe that change was possible despite the challenges. James Williams continued his fight against racism, realizing that its scale required deeper, more comprehensive solutions. He began to expand his work, involving various experts, community leaders, and activists in his efforts. His work to create a fund for victims of racist attacks evolved into a broader initiative to reform the justice system and law enforcement. Creating a platform for activism, James created a platform that brought together activists, advocates, and researchers working on issues of racism and bias. The platform provided resources, organizational support, and strategic guidance for various anti-racism initiatives. The platform hosted webinars, discussions, and roundtables to discuss key issues and propose concrete actions to change the system. He worked extensively with universities and research institutions to support research into racism and discrimination. James understood that real change required deep research and evidence that could inform political and social reform. He helped create and support programs to study racial bias and develop strategies to overcome it. Political activity and lobbying. James also began working actively with politicians and legislators to push for changes to laws around racism and bias. He helped draft and promote legislation to improve transparency and accountability in law enforcement. James testified before legislators to share his experience as an advocate for reform to prevent systemic injustice. His lobbying efforts have focused on creating independent commissions to investigate racist police behavior, improving racism education in schools, and enacting strict standards for the use of force by law enforcement. James and his team have also worked to improve the complaints process and prosecution of discrimination cases. Psychological support and personal recovery. Realizing that personal recovery and mental health were an important part of the fight, James began to devote more time to his emotional and psychological needs. He sought professional counseling and therapy to help him cope with the post-traumatic stress and depression caused by his experience. James realized that only by taking care of his own health would he be able to continue his activism and help others. James also began running support groups for others who had experienced racist attacks and discrimination. These groups provided a safe space for sharing experiences, emotional support, and practical advice on how to overcome difficulties. James shared his knowledge and experience, helping participants find ways to improve their lives and recover from trauma. Public campaigns and social movements. Never one to miss an opportunity to use the media to advance his ideas. James actively supported public campaigns and social movements aimed at combating racism. He organized rallies, demonstrations, and social media campaigns to draw attention to issues of racial injustice and discrimination. These actions attracted the general public and helped to form a united front against racism. James was also active in cultural projects, such as art exhibitions and theater productions that explored themes of racism and bias. He believed that art and culture could play an important role in changing public perceptions and promoting a deeper understanding of the issue. Impact on youth and future generations. One of James's key strategies was working with young people. He held lectures and workshops in schools and colleges to raise awareness of racism and develop critical thinking in students. James believed that educating the younger generation was key to creating a more just society. He also worked to create educational programs and materials that could be used in schools and universities to teach the history of racism and how to overcome it. James believed that education could change public attitudes and prepare the next generation to actively fight discrimination. Continuous struggle and personal dedication to the cause. James continued to face challenges and difficulties every day, but his personal commitment remained unwavering. He knew that change takes time and effort, and despite his own suffering, he remained committed to his mission. James continued to seek ways to improve his life and the lives of others, remaining a symbol of resilience and hope. His story of struggle and overcoming served as an inspiration to many and a reminder that every step towards justice matters. James understood that the fight against racism was not only his personal task, but also a collective effort that required the participation of each of us. And despite all the difficulties, he continued to believe that change was possible and his work would contribute to a more just and equal world. After James Williams became the face of the fight against racism and brought attention to bias in law enforcement, police officer Daniel Clark's life changed dramatically. After Clark's firing, his life became difficult and stressful. First and foremost, his public image was in tatters. He became a symbol of racist behavior within the police force, and this negative attention made his life extremely difficult. Local media outlets constantly covered his story, and his name became associated with bias and discrimination. Clark faced constant public condemnation and criticism, which caused him emotional and mental stress. His personal life also saw significant changes. Due to his negative reputation, Clark faced problems in his relationships with others. He became the target of ridicule and scorn in society, and many former friends and acquaintances distanced themselves from him. His family also experienced difficulties, as public disapproval and pressure affected their daily lives. This led to tensions within the family and problems in Clark's personal life. Professionally, Clark faced significant challenges. After leaving the police force, he tried to find work, but his reputation for bias proved a significant barrier. Most employers, given his history, avoided him. For a time, he received offers from organizations that supported his views, but these were few and far between and did not provide a steady income. Clark also faced financial difficulties. The legal costs and compensation awarded as a result of James's lawsuit put pressure on his finances. He was forced to use his savings and look for additional sources of income to cope with his financial problems. Mentally, Clark also experienced significant stress. The public shaming and negative attention took a toll on his emotional state. He sought therapy and counseling to help him cope with his depression and anxiety, but the recovery process was long and difficult. Ultimately, Daniel Clark's life was changed forever. His actions and bias became emblematic of the problems in the justice system, and the consequences of his actions continued to impact his life. Despite his attempts to find a new path, his former career and reputation remained in serious question, and he continued to face the consequences of his actions for years to come. After Daniel Clark was fired from the police force and found guilty of racist behavior, his life began to change rapidly. The public attention to his actions attracted not only support from those fighting racism, but also a significant amount of hatred. Clark became a symbol of racial bias in law enforcement, which caused a wide public outcry. At the same time, James Williams, despite his victory in court, faced new challenges. The public attention to his case attracted not only support, but also a flood of hate from groups that espouse racist views. Thousands of negative comments and threats against James appeared on social media and forums. These threats were not limited to virtual space. His home and office were vandalized. He and his family began receiving anonymous threats and insults, creating an atmosphere of constant threat. These events left a deep mark on the mental health of James and his family. They began to experience fear and anxiety on a daily basis, especially after unknown persons began to follow them. His children were bullied and threatened at school, which became an additional source of stress and pain for the entire family. James and his family began to actively work with psychologists and therapists to cope with the effects of the traumatic experience and prevent further deterioration of their condition. James also noticed that racism was not only present in institutions, but also in public life. Despite his efforts to create programs and resources to combat racism, he experienced overt discrimination in his neighborhood. Racist and prejudiced attitudes were on the rise, especially in neighborhoods where black people were a minority. This manifested itself in denial of services, derogatory comments, and even threats. Many of James's early supporters began to withdraw their support under pressure from those opposed to change. This was seen in political circles and in business, where fear of losing clients or political connections became a reason for withdrawing support. James felt that his efforts to create a just society were being met with serious resistance. Despite this, James continued to work to reform the justice system and law enforcement. He pushed for more transparent and accountable systems, demanded better standards for police investigations, and increased oversight of law enforcement. He also focused on education and outreach, organizing trainings and events aimed at educating people about racism and bias. These efforts were aimed at creating more inclusive and understanding communities. Political resistance also became a significant obstacle. Some politicians and government officials tried to water down the demands for reform for fear of losing voter support or facing protests. This undermined James's efforts and demonstrated how difficult the fight for justice can be. Ultimately, James continued his fight despite the odds. His story and activism became a symbol of how individual struggle can become a catalyst for broader social change. Despite significant resistance and difficult circumstances, James remained committed to his cause, believing that real change is possible if you continue to work toward a just and equal society. Despite the difficult challenges and deep personal pain, James Williams did not give up. He continued to actively work to improve the situation around racism, turning his ordeal into a catalyst for significant change. His efforts began to bear fruit, creating a more inclusive and equitable society. James expanded his activism initiatives to create a range of programs and partnerships aimed at systemic improvement. He collaborated with advocacy organizations, educational institutions, and local communities to create meaningful change. One key step was creating educational programs that addressed racism and bias. James worked with educators and educational experts to develop courses that included the history of racism, its impact, and ways to combat bias. These courses were integrated into school and university curricula, providing young people with the tools and knowledge to create a more inclusive future. Students who participated in these programs began to actively confront racist bias and became advocates for change in their communities. James also initiated a mentoring program for racially minority youth. This program provided opportunities for professional growth and development, helping young people from disadvantaged areas find career paths and achieve success. He organized meetings with successful professionals who shared their stories and gave advice on overcoming obstacles. This program had a significant impact on the lives of many young people, giving them the confidence and resources to achieve their goals. At the community level, James organized a series of public events aimed at strengthening ties between different groups. He initiated dialogue platforms where representatives of different ethnic and cultural groups could openly discuss their experiences, problems, and suggestions for improving interaction. These meetings contributed to greater understanding and respect between people, reducing tensions and promoting social cohesion. An important part of his work has been working with law enforcement agencies to improve their interactions with communities. James has worked to develop new standards and practices for police services aimed at preventing bias and improving public trust. He has been actively involved in creating training programs for police officers that include topics on racial bias, cultural competence, and fair use of force. These programs have been incorporated into police training courses and have begun to show positive results in improving interactions between police and communities. His work also led to legislative change. James lobbied for laws to increase oversight of law enforcement and improve enforcement practices. As a result of his efforts, several states passed new laws requiring independent investigations into use of force incidents and giving citizens more avenues to file complaints about police conduct. As reforms and new programs progressed, James witnessed positive changes in society. Hatred and prejudice began to decline, and support and understanding grew. Although the fight against racism and discrimination remained urgent, James saw that his efforts were beginning to bear fruit, and this gave him the strength to continue his work. His story of struggle and perseverance has become an inspiration to many. James has proven that even after great adversity, change can be achieved and a more just society can be created. His personal experiences have become a powerful catalyst for social progress, and his activism has continued to impact lives, helping to create a world where racism and discrimination give way to respect and equality. As James Williams continued his fight against racism, he saw real change in society. Although the road to it was long and difficult, he and his team achieved significant success despite many obstacles. One of the most important achievements was the introduction of anti-racism education programs. These programs extended beyond schools and universities to corporate and community organizations. James worked with educational experts and cultural mentors to create courses that focused on racial bias awareness and cultural competence. Schools and universities began to actively integrate these programs into their curricula, which helped create a new generation that was more aware and ready to take action against discrimination. At the same time, James initiated the creation of support centers in various communities. These centers became important resources for people who experienced racism and discrimination. They provided legal assistance, psychological support, and educational resources to help people cope with the effects of bias and discrimination. In addition, these centers organized community events such as cultural festivals and discussions that helped strengthen ties between different ethnic groups and increase mutual understanding. James also focused on partnering with businesses to help companies implement diversity and inclusion strategies. He worked with businesses to create programs that ensured equal opportunities for all employees. These programs included anti-bias training, reviewing recruitment and promotion practices, and measures to create a safe and supportive work environment. The results began to show in the form of more inclusive and equitable workplaces where diversity and equality were valued and respected. At the justice level, James continued to push for reforms to improve practices and increase oversight of law enforcement. He worked with advocates and legislators to develop and implement new laws that required independent investigations into police brutality and bias. Measures were taken to improve transparency and accountability in law enforcement, which helped build public trust in the justice system. As reforms and new initiatives progressed, James began to see positive changes in society. Racist and prejudiced attitudes began to wane, and support for equality and inclusion grew. The secret to James's success was not only his persistence, but also his ability to attract allies and create positive examples of change. His efforts led to more and more people realizing the importance of fighting racism and bias. Over time, James became a symbol of change, inspiring others to take action and showing that even after significant challenges, it is possible to create a more just and equal society. His story demonstrated that perseverance, collaboration, and personal commitment can be powerful tools in the fight against discrimination and bias. Several years after the incident with police officer Daniel Clark and the subsequent struggle of James Williams, the memory of that incident was still alive in the public consciousness, but it had taken on new connotations. The Clark incident, which initially became a symbol of racial bias in law enforcement, was now seen as a landmark event in the broader fight for social justice. The case not only brought attention to issues of racism, but also became a catalyst for significant changes in society and law enforcement. People, especially those who closely followed James Williams's career, remembered the incident as a turning point. School and university classes discussed how the incident highlighted systemic problems and led to important reforms. Human rights curricula and programs cited the case as an example of the importance of combating bias and the need for reform in law enforcement. The media did not forget about the case either. Documentaries, articles, and news reports continued to tell the story of James Williams and Daniel Clark, highlighting how the incident became part of a larger fight for racial justice. Although Clark himself had long since been sidelined, his actions and the consequences for him became part of educational programs aimed at raising awareness of racism and bias. Yet the memory of the incident also remained a source of controversy and division. For some people, particularly those opposed to reform, the Clark incident remained a sensitive issue. They used the case as an argument against change, pointing to the complexities and contradictions surrounding its aftermath. This strained public discussions about racial justice and policing reform. James Williams, while seeing more visible and positive changes, knew the fight was not over. He continued his work, building on the gains and focusing his efforts on further advancing inclusion and equality. He used his platform to remind society of the importance of not forgetting the lessons of the past and continuing to work toward a more just world. The memory of Officer Daniel Clark and the James Williams incident remained alive in the public consciousness, a reminder of how far society has come in its fight against racism and bias, and how important it is to continue moving forward to finally overcome these issues. Over time, James Williams saw his efforts to combat racism and bias begin to bear real fruit. The public began to discuss issues of racial injustice more actively, and the public atmosphere gradually changed. The reforms that began after the Daniel Clark incident became part of a new approach to justice and equality. James continued his work, but with a certain sense of satisfaction. He saw how the educational programs he created began to bear fruit. A new generation was more aware and prepared to confront racism. Support centers became important resources for many people, and their work helped people cope with the consequences of discrimination. Businesses began to implement diversity and inclusion practices, creating more equitable workplaces. Progress has also been made in the justice system, with new laws and practices improving transparency and accountability in law enforcement. These changes have helped restore trust between the police and the community, allowing for a more constructive dialogue about the challenges facing minorities. While James continued to work to improve the situation, he felt that he had achieved significant results. The memory of the Clark case and the subsequent reforms served as a reminder that the fight for justice takes perseverance and time, but it can bring long-awaited change. James did not forget that the road to equality was long and difficult, but he also knew that his efforts, although incomplete, had played a key role in moving toward a better society. At the end of his journey, James looked back on the accomplishments he had made with pride and hope. He knew that the work of fighting racism and bias would not be completely over, but he was confident that the changes that had occurred had laid the foundation for a future where equality and justice would be more central to society. In his heart remained a deep conviction that every step, every effort, every change he was able to initiate was part of a larger struggle to create a world in which all people would be treated equally and have equal opportunities. James Williams, despite all the challenges, left a significant legacy that continued to inspire others to fight for justice and equality. James Williams' story ended with him leaving an indelible mark in his fight for justice. His efforts to overcome racism and bias created lasting changes in society that became the foundation for future generations. The memory of the hardships he endured and the victories he achieved continued to inspire others. James ended his activism career with the satisfaction of knowing that his work had left the world a little better than it had been before. His story became an example of how personal challenges can be a catalyst for massive change, and how perseverance, courage, and determination can change the course of history. With each passing year, the attention to his case and the aftermath of the incident with police officer Daniel Clark only strengthened the understanding and awareness of the importance of fighting racism. James left behind a legacy that continued to support and inspire people in their quest for a more just and equal society. And while the road to eradicating racism was still a long way off, James Williams' work served as an important reminder that even in the most difficult circumstances, it is possible to make a difference and change the world for the better. Dear viewers, what do you think of James Williams' story and his fight against racism? We'd love to hear your thoughts on how things unfolded and what moments stood out to you. Please leave your comments below and share your thoughts. Also, we are interested in how long you have been following our channel. Your opinion is very important to us, and we want to make content that is really interesting to you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the bell to not miss new videos. We try our best to provide you with quality content, and your support is very important to us. We wish you all the best and hope to see you in the next episode. Sincerely, Epic Life Story.